The snow was relentless, swallowing the road in a blinding torrent of white. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale beneath the dim light of the dashboard. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a simple drive into a desperate fight to stay on the road. Visibility was almost non-existent. The headlights barely pierced the thick wall of snow ahead, and the wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Just him, the car, and the endless snow. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a shadow in the distance, barely discernible through the storm. As the car drew closer, the shadow took form. A woman standing by the roadside, her long coat flapping in the wind. She didn't wave or signal for help. She simply stood there, her face turned toward the storm. Ethan slowed the car to a crawl, rolling down the window just enough for his voice to carry. "Hey, do you need a ride?" The woman turned to him, her face pale and expressionless. For a moment she just stared as though she hadn't heard him. Then, without a word, she opened the passenger door and climbed in. She brought the cold with her. The air inside the car dropped several degrees, frost forming on the edges of the window where she sat. Ethan shivered, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. Her hair was damp with melting snow, her coat dusted with frost. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Rough night to be out here," Ethan said, trying to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and turned the radio dial. The sound crackled to life, but it wasn't music that filled the car. It was a haunting, wavering melody, like a lullaby sung in a language Ethan didn't recognize. The sound made his skin crawl, and he quickly reached to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The song played on, growing louder, the notes twisting into something unnatural. Ethan's unease deepened. He tried to focus on the road, but it seemed different now, stretched, unending. The trees on either side loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, the woman's reflection in the windshield seemed wrong. Her face wasn't her face. It was hollow, her eyes dark voids that seemed to stare right through him. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Where are you going?" Finally, she turned to him. Her lips moved, but her voice was faint, almost drowned out by the howling wind. "Home." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't know where home was, but he had a sinking feeling he was heading there too. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the snowstorm growing thicker, heavier. The car's engine groaned, the dashboard lights dimming, and for the first time, Ethan noticed something he couldn't explain. The odometer wasn't moving. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The woman didn't react, didn't even flinch. He turned to her, his voice rising. "What is this? What's happening?" She looked at him with an expression of infinite sadness. "You're almost there." The blizzard howled louder, the car shaking as if caught in the grip of something immense. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the truth. This wasn't a road, and this wasn't a storm. He was driving through a memory, one that he couldn't escape. His last memory. He turned back to the woman, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, frosted over as though she'd never been there. The haunting melody on the radio faded, replaced by silence. And then the snow began to clear. Ethan saw the wreckage first, the twisted remains of a car lying in a ditch by the roadside. his car. He saw himself next, slumped over the wheel, frost clinging to his lifeless form. And standing beside the wreck, watching silently, was the woman. The storm began to close in again, the whiteness consuming everything. Ethan felt the pull, dragging him back into the endless drive, back into the memory that would never let him go. The road stretched on forever. It had been a year since Eliza's husband, Samuel, had passed away. The snow fell softly, covering the cemetery in a blanket of quiet stillness, as it always did in late winter. She visited the grave every week, despite the cold, despite the ache in her chest that had yet to subside. Samuel's headstone was simple, just his name, the dates, and a small engraving of a rose, their favorite flower. But this visit was different. The moment Eliza stepped onto the snow-covered path, she felt something. A warmth, faint and almost imperceptible, like the presence of someone standing just behind her. She turned quickly, but there was no one. Only the stillness of the cemetery stretched out before her, the old trees swaying gently in the wind. As she knelt by Samuel's grave, brushing the snow away from the stone, she noticed something strange. There, just beyond the row of tombstones, was a figure standing still in the distance. At first, she thought it might be another visitor, someone else lost in their grief. But as she looked closer, she saw that the figure was not quite right. It was as if the person had been caught in a snowstorm, their form covered in frost, as though the cold itself had wrapped around them. The figure was motionless, yet there was something comforting in their presence, as though they were simply waiting. Eliza's heart quickened, a familiar, bittersweet ache blooming in her chest. She stood up slowly, walking closer. As she did, the figure began to move toward her, each step deliberate, slow. The closer Eliza got, the more she could make out the details. The frost covering the figure's shoulders, the way the snow seemed to melt in patches around their feet, until she realized with a start that it was no stranger at all. It was Samuel. His features were indistinct, as though formed of fog and ice, but she knew. The warmth she had felt earlier, that familiar presence, it was him. He stood silently before her, as if waiting for her to speak. His hands were outstretched, palms open, as though offering something she could not see. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. The air was still, and for a moment there was no answer. But then, slowly, the figure nodded, the frosted edges of his form shimmering faintly in the dim light. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't really there, not in the way she wanted him to be. Yet, in this strange and quiet moment, she felt as though he was closer than he had been in all the months since his passing. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold air where his hands had been, and for a fleeting instant she felt a warmth, like a hand holding hers. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped back, not wanting to disturb the delicate, fragile contact they shared. The frost on his form seemed to grow more intense, and she realized he was beginning to fade, as though the wind had caught him. "Samuel," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I miss you. I wish I could have you back." He did not speak, but his form shifted slightly, tilting his head as though listening. The feeling of warmth around her grew, a presence that spoke louder than words ever could. He was here, in this moment, just as he had always been, quiet, comforting, and enduring. Before she could say another word, the wind picked up again, and the figure of Samuel began to dissolve, vanishing into the swirling snow. Eliza stood in silence for a long time, the snowflakes settling back onto the ground, the frost melting into the air. But his presence lingered, warm and constant. As Eliza turned to leave, she looked back one last time at the place where Samuel had stood. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, covering the grave in a fresh layer, and with it she felt the touch of something familiar, something eternal. The snowstorm raged, an endless cascade of white smothering the landscape and blotting out the stars. Evelyn Walker tugged her coat tighter, the wind biting through every layer like sharp teeth. Her car had skidded off the icy road hours ago, and now she was trudging blindly through knee-deep snow, her flashlight barely piercing the swirling void. When she spotted the faint outline of a building through the storm, relief washed over her. The structure, a weathered old inn, stood crooked and dark against the snow. Its wooden sign creaked ominously in the wind, the name Wintervale Lodge barely legible beneath a thick coat of frost. She banged on the door with frozen fingers. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The door swung inward on its own, groaning on rusted hinges. Evelyn hesitated but stepped inside, grateful for the shelter. The air inside was stale and cold, the faint scent of charred wood lingering as if a fire had burned there long ago. A faded rug covered the wooden floor, and a dusty chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals shimmering faintly in the dim light from her flashlight. She called out again, her voice echoing eerily. "Hello." Silence. Then faintly the sound of a clock chiming. Evelyn turned toward the noise and saw a grandfather clock at the end of the hall. Its hands pointed to midnight, though the pendulum did not move. She frowned. She hadn't noticed it at first, yet it seemed to dominate the room now, casting long shadows across the walls. She walked toward it, her boots crunching on the wooden floor. As she reached out to touch the glass, a cold gust of wind slammed the front door shut. The noise startled her, and when she turned back toward the clock, its hands were spinning wildly. Evelyn stumbled backward as the room tilted. The chandelier above began to sway, and the air grew heavier. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she felt as though she were falling into nothingness. When she opened her eyes, she was outside again. The storm raged as fiercely as before, and her car was in the exact spot where it had skidded off the road. She blinked in confusion, her breath clouding the freezing air. Had she blacked out, dreamed the whole thing? Her flashlight flickered, and she turned toward the faint outline of Wintervale Lodge. The building stood exactly as it had before, as though she had never entered. Her heart raced as she stumbled toward it, her footsteps following the same path through the snow. When she pushed open the door, the same creak greeted her, and the same cold, empty interior awaited. The grandfather clock stood at the end of the hall, its hands pointing to midnight. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't possible." The loop began again, and again. Each time she tried something different, walking away from the lodge, breaking a window to escape, smashing the clock. Yet, no matter what she did, she always found herself outside, trudging through the snow toward the cursed inn. It wasn't until the 7th loop that she noticed the voices. At first they were faint, whispers carried on the howling wind. Then they grew louder, emerging from the walls, the floors, the very air around her. They spoke of betrayal, of blood spilled, of an unbroken curse. Evelyn began to piece it together. The lodge had once been a haven for travelers, but on a night much like this one, a terrible crime had taken place. A woman had been murdered, her body left to freeze in the storm. The innkeeper, a man named Charles Mercer, had been accused, but he swore his innocence to the very end. He hanged himself before the trial, leaving the lodge's reputation forever stained. Now, it seemed, the storm and the lodge were bound together, feeding on anyone unfortunate enough to stumble upon them. The malevolent force driving the loop wanted her to see it all, to witness the tragedy and become part of it. On the final loop, Evelyn followed the whispers. They led her to a trapdoor beneath the rug in the lobby. She pried it open with trembling hands and descended into the darkness below. The cellar was cold and damp, the walls lined with shelves of dusty jars and rotting crates. At the center of the room lay a shallow grave, the bones within long since stripped of flesh. The air grew heavy and the whispers became a deafening roar. The shadows coalesced into a figure, its face obscured but its form radiating pure malice. Evelyn's flashlight sputtered and died, plunging her into darkness. "What do you want?" she screamed, her voice breaking. The figure moved closer and the air around her grew colder still. She could barely breathe as it whispered in her ear. "Justice. For who?" Evelyn managed to choke out. The figure stretched a hand towards the grave. Images flashed in her mind. A young woman, frightened and pleading, running through a storm. A shadowy figure pursuing her, a struggle. And then the cold silence of death. The innkeeper's face appeared last, contorted in anguish as the noose tightened around his neck. The truth slammed into Evelyn like the wind outside. The innkeeper had been innocent. The true killer had never been caught. "What can I do?" Evelyn whispered. "How do I set you free?" The figure's hand brushed her forehead and a name echoed in her mind. The name of the killer. Evelyn's eyes snapped open and she found herself in the lodge's lobby, the storm still raging outside. Clutching the name like a lifeline, she staggered toward the clock and whispered it aloud. The clock stopped. The storm outside faded to silence. And then, for the first time, Evelyn felt warmth, not from the air, but from the sense of release as the figure dissolved into the light. Evelyn awoke one final time. The storm was gone, the night calm and still. The lodge had vanished, leaving only an empty field where it once stood. She staggered back to the road and found her car, miraculously unscathed. As she drove away, her rearview mirror fogged over, and a single word appeared, traced by an unseen hand. "I rest now."